Hi, my name is Chris, and today in this video I want to talk to you about the menu of the Canon EOS R5 C, specifically the video side of things. Because if you are coming from any kind of mirrorless camera that is in the Canon lineup, then this will probably be something very new to you, as it was for me. When I first had this camera in my hands, it was completely unused to the menu structure here, because of course the video menu for the photo cameras like the R or the R5 and even previous cameras like the 5D Mark II and stuff like that, those were more baked into each other and just looking very similar. Here you have a camera that switches between photo and video mode completely independent from each other. Now, first up, when you are looking at the camera, you can see that the layout of everything is already significantly different from what you are probably going to be used to with the normal operating system. Of course, we can cycle through a couple of different layouts. There are all kinds of settings that you can make around that. I am not going to dive deep into every single setting. This is mostly just a menu walkthrough to give you an idea as to what is going on. Now, to get into the menu, there are actually two ways. First, you have the menu button up at the corner right there, and then you also have this menu button right here, which is usually the quick access menu in the photo side of things. Now, when you press the menu button, you end up in a menu like this. And interestingly enough, this is not going to disable the live view. It is just going to be overlaid on top of all of that so that the video itself is going to continue in the background. Now, this is also something that I found in other people complaining about the battery life of this camera being the same whether you're filming or not filming. In a cinema workflow, you cannot really know what is going on with the HDMI port. So in that regard, this camera will always produce the exact same image as if it would be recording, and it is going to send that out via HDMI. Now, there's something to be said whether or not that makes sense. Maybe it would be nice to have a setting inside of the camera to choose whether or not you only want high quality recording when you are actually recording on the camera, or if it should do that all the time. But as of right now, you're always going to be processing the same sensor image as if you are already recording. Now, when you go into the menu on the left side here, you first up have the camera setup, and right here you have the iris modes. Something to note here is that the iris is basically the aperture that we know in photography. So in that regard, this is very known, but at the same time, it's also not. Interesting is also that you can actually choose auto iris. So that is an option for you so that the camera actually manages the iris and you just do the AE shift. So plus or minus a couple of EV or something like that. You can then also adjust whether or not you want half stops or thirds, and if it should do fine increments. The fine increments are actually quite nice when you're using the camera for adjusting the light that hits the sensor, and the iris is actually going to go much smoother when you have the fine adjustments turned on. Now, to jump between these menus, you can actually use your finger. So you either kind of like tap on everything, but to be honest, those things are all really, really tiny. So tapping is not really my own preferred choice to kind of like navigate through here. What you can do is you can use this wheel here to basically go up and down in the menu structure. And then you also have the wheel at the top right here. So you have this one right there. And with that, you can actually just choose and go from 1, 2, 3, and so on. You can also use the joystick to navigate the menus. So you can up and down. You can also enter a menu point by just pressing into the joystick. And you can navigate all the way up to jump between the main menu points. And you can also navigate the pages by going left and right. Now, I found that most of the time I use the wheel at the top and here around the set button. So this is the first menu page that we already have covered now. On the second page, you have the shutter mode. So you can actually choose between what you want to do here. If you want to have the angle so that it adjusts automatically based on the frame rate that you're shooting. If you want to specifically use a shutter speed and so on and so forth. You have all the settings around the ISO and the gain, which is also interesting to kind of like know, okay, there's actually two different systems that are used in filmmaking. You have ISO and you have gain. I am more comfortable and familiar with ISO, so that's what I am personally using. Then on the next page, we have light metering modes and AE shift and those kind of things. So you have those settings. Shockless white balance is again a way to make the adjustments between white balance changes not as harsh, and it just fades in between those essentially. And then we also have the color temperature increments either in mirrored or Kelvin. Again, for me, I come from the photography side, and the mirrorless cameras like the EOS R, there it's Kelvin that is used, so that's also what I set this setting to. Now with the AE shift and AE response, with those two, you have basically control over how you want to overexpose or underexpose your image. So this here is basically the EV adjustment that you also can do on photography. So you can say this should be like +2 or +1 in the exposure adjustment. Then we also have AE responsiveness, and here you can basically say how fast should the camera react when the light changes. So that's the option here. Light metering is for whether you have backlight or you want a spot meter or you want to just use the standard modes. Then going over, we have the autofocus settings. Now around the autofocus, you can say a lot about this, and you have a ton of different modes, and it works very different to, let's say, a Canon EOS R. Options to say you want to have continuous autofocus only around the focus point, or you want to just enable this at all times. You can say where the autofocus should trigger, either in the large frame, small or whole area. And you have the frame position, which you can either make selectable with the joystick or in the center. And of course, you have autofocus speed, and you also have the AF responsiveness. This, of course, is only available if it is actually enabled. So then you can actually adjust how responsive and how fast the autofocus should rack between two different spots. Now for me, in my personal use, I most of the time use autofocus enabled, and then I also want to use face detect, which is the next page. Now here you can of course say if you want to have face detect at all, and for me, I oftentimes use face detect, so I set this to on. I usually use face priority, but face only is a mode that I have not known before, but face only is also extremely interesting because it basically means that if the face leaves the frame, the camera's not going to search for focus. So that's really interesting as well. And then you can also enable or disable eye detection autofocus. Now I'm gonna just disable the continuous autofocus again for this walkthrough so that we are not going to be distracted by that. However, note that you can also enable face detection despite having continuous autofocus disabled, which basically means that this mode or autofocus basically, you still have the AF on button right here on the camera. And as long as you don't change that setting, you can just press that and it's going to lock on focus on whatever is in the frame and things should be in focus. So if you're using face detect and tracking and you use the continuous mode autofocus disabled, then you can use the AF on and hold that down to focus on whatever face is in the frame. Now, when we go one step further, we have ABB. This is for some kind of black value adjustment. And we have different color bars that we can display on the screen. I personally don't really know what necessarily is useful here. Maybe this is for some kind of calibration or something like that, but I haven't really used those kind of settings right here. But you can also use this for like things like distortion and aberration correction and stuff like that. Now we can go over one step further. On the 7th page, we have the digital IS. So here you can choose whether you want to turn this on or off. And then you can also say if you want to have it on high or on standard strength, basically. Note that the digital IS always crops into the image to actually be able to do its adjustments. So if you see that on the frame here, when I enable this, you see that it jumps in a little bit. And if I go to high, it is jumping in a little more. So that is something to be aware of. And down here, you can also see that when you are using some kind of an anamorphic camera lens, then you can also adjust the stabilization for that. And with that, we can go over to the custom picture profiles. Here, you can actually choose between a ton of different ones. Now here you have the BT709 wide DR, then you have Canon Log 3, PQ, HLG, BT709 standard, EOS standard, neutral, and then you have yours that you can actually set up yourself and make your adjustments there. You can also edit those setups. However, those with a key next to them will not be overwritten, but instead you will always just create a new one in the other profiles. So that's something that you can do there. The next menu over is the recording and media setup. There you can do things like initialize the media, which essentially is formatting the media, so be aware of the wording there. Then we have the sensor mode, and of course you can choose between full frame, Super 35 and Super 16. You have the system frequency, main recording format, and many other settings around that. Now, I'm not going to go into detail with these because the combinations and possibilities are so endless that it's going to take forever to talk about that in this video. And I'm probably going to go over the shooting modes and recording settings in another video. Now, when you go over, you can also see that you have the recording mode, and there you can choose between, of course, the slow motion, what you want to do with the recording in terms of like pre-recording and frame rates and interval and all of those kind of things. So it's really, really vast what you can do there. And of course, if you go, for example, for slow fast with the audio, then you can also adjust the frame rate that you would like to have, like for example, going for 120 frames per second. In the next page, we have the second card recording options. So there you can choose whether you want to have a main recording and a sub recording, or you want to do a main and the audio. And of course, you also have relay as well as double slot recording. But of course, you have to be aware which kind of formats you still can record in these different modes. And you might want to look at the PDF or the advanced video manual for this camera to be able to know what exactly can work with which formatted camera, card, and all those kind of things. Personally, I usually don't use the second card slot that much at this point, but I can see myself using the recording of, for example, proxies or a sub-recording on the second card if I'm, for example, doing raw recording and those kind of things. Then one over, we have metadata, so you can adjust a lot of the metadata that you want to store inside of your files. Then you also can say whether you want to have HDMI timecode, sending that out to whatever device you are using with the record command as well, so that the external device actually starts recording when you hit the record button on the camera. With MP4 clip and photo numbering, you can choose whether you want to reset that continuously or use it ongoing. And then you have the volume label and those kind of things. One step over, we have audio settings. In this case, you can see there is no real setup needed because I currently do not have anything connected to the camera that would warrant any additional setup, because the internal microphones basically always use automatic gain. The same thing is true if you go over one step and another and another. This is actually the place where you start seeing some setup processes that you can choose, like headphone volume, test tone, and those kind of things. But on the other pages here, you basically have those settings around things like linking the channels for stereo recording, or if you want to adjust the volume of the left and right channel individually. And if you have the module for the top of the camera, then you also can do that for all of the 4 channels. Now, I find this extremely useful because it basically means that you can actually use a left-right splitter cable, plug that into the microphone port, and then you can adjust which microphone you want to have with which audio gain, essentially, and you can do that individually. So that's really cool. And it is also really cool that you can actually record the camera internal microphones and the microphone that you have connected to the camera at the same time, because you can record up to 4 channels of audio into the files on the camera. So this works with XFAVC as well as the HEVC files. Both of those can record up to 4 channels with the right settings. So that's really nice. But we're going to move forward now and go over to the next point, and that is all kinds of display settings. Now here you can see we have things like the LCD brightness, colors, contrast, and those kind of things. I usually don't change anything on this page because I want the image as original as possible. However, I did change the luminance, and this is actually something interesting. When I reduce the luminance, you can see that the display actually got significantly darker. Now, if I increase the brightness, you will see that it looks very different from increasing actually the luminance. So increasing the brightness is actually the wrong setting if you want to make the monitor brighter. In this case, you want to go with the luminance and put that at +2, for example. And down here, you can choose whether you want to have the viewfinder activated, or you want to just have the LCD, or you want whatever settings you might choose here. I usually use it at automatic. Then we have the viewfinder, same settings here. So you can adjust again the brightness, colors, as well as the sharpness and luminance. Usually for me, the luminance is fine there. It's just the luminance of the LCD is too dark for my taste when it's just on the normal setting. Then we can go over anamorphic LCD, anamorphic viewfinder. So you basically can activate the de-squeeze for anamorphic lenses in the LCD viewfinder or HDMI. And it's really cool that you can choose this individually, because it basically means that you can send a de-squeezed image to your external monitor, for example, your Atomos Ninja V for recording, but you can still use the internal camera monitor and you basically see the not de-squeezed image there. That can be helpful. And it's really something that they have with all kinds of settings. So for example, you can do the same thing with a black and white image. You can make that basically black and white internally, but the HDMI out still has the color image. So that's really cool. Then we have the OSD output. Right now you are seeing that on the external monitor because I'm also recording that, but you can choose whether you want to have the menus also show up on the external monitor. And this is a place where you can make all kinds of adjustments in terms of the display and whether you want to have, for example, the peripheral border around or not, and those kind of settings. So there's a lot that you can do here. And if you are in the US and you want to have your feed, then of course you can also change that here. Then we have more OSD settings. So you can either choose the opacity of those things, you can make it turn around. So you, for example, want to use this menu on a social media rig or something where you want to shoot vertical video, then you can also make that adjustment here. And we have more settings in terms of view assist, selecting view assist, and also the different settings in terms of like external view assist of the HDMI port or the internal monitor and the viewfinder. This of course is useful when you're shooting C-Log and you want to have that converted to a Rec. 709 color space for easier adjustment making and those kind of things. And then we have the range of the HDMI, and there you can choose whether you have a full range recording or a narrow range. And I think that is for the color space, basically going from either 0 to 255 or from 16 to 240 something. I think that is what is going on here. And with that, we are over to the kind of like helpful things that you might want to have on your display in terms of assistance functions. Here you can enable the focus guide. So that's this like green box that comes around and shows you how you have to focus in or out. So that's really helpful. Then you have peaking menus. So you can have focus peaking going on, for example, so that you have an easier time focusing and you can see that. And you can actually set up two different focus peaking setups. So in this case, it's set up for white colors around the borders with a gain of 8 and a frequency of 2. And then you have another one, which is red with 15 and 1 as the frequency. So that's really helpful because you can basically make two different setups, and you can also, again, choose whether you want to have that in the viewfinder, LCD, or HDMI port. Going one over, we have the magnification settings, and you actually have a button that is designated for magnification, and you can make your adjustments here. For example, things like whether you want to have a black and white image when you are using magnification and where you want to have the magnification output go to. And of course, if you want to have it turned on or off. Going another one, we have false colors. There you have one very helpful page that is the false color index, basically showing you what the different colors in the false color picture profile should look like or what you are aiming for and those kind of things. And you can, of course, enable it on the external monitor, viewfinder, or LCD. Then we have zebras. Again, we have two different zebras that you can set up. And again, you can also choose external, internal, or viewfinder. So that's another possibility. Same thing for the waveforms. You have different kind of setups there that you can make. And we can go over to markers. Again, different setups so that you can make sure whether you want to have those internally or externally enabled. Then we have more markers, so we can make a center marker and those kind of things, and you can choose whether you want to have that in a different color. So that's really cool. And you have grid markers, of course, as well. And there you can see it's basically a thirds grid. Now, if I go out of the menu, then you can see we have a grid right there. And you can set that up however you want, basically. The next one is aspect markers. So here you can, again, choose you want to have a mask with a certain percentage, or you want to have it just completely black lines, stuff like that. and you can choose what kind of an aspect ratio you would like to work with. Of course, that can be really helpful if you are shooting for some kind of a specific aspect ratio and you want to make sure that you have everything inside of that box. Then, of course, we can go over and have safe area stuff. That might be interesting for TV work. Now, personally, I don't usually use those things because mobile phones and those kind of things don't necessarily have the necessity for these kind of setups. And last but not least, we have user markers. So you can make different things there and you have a lot of flexibility for this. Now we are getting over to the network tab. And here I actually have to maybe give you a complaint or talk about a complaint I have. Now this camera actually has Bluetooth and Wi-Fi built into the body. However, that's only working in photo mode. In video mode, you will have to buy the additional grip, like the battery grip, with the Wi-Fi and LAN connection module. There, however, you also don't have two batteries that are working the camera. You have one battery working the Wi-Fi module and the LAN module, and one battery that is powering the camera. These settings here are all regarding this Wi-Fi module, and you can only enable this if you actually have this connected. I don't necessarily like that because there's Wi-Fi built in, there's Bluetooth built in. Please give us an option to actually use these features so that we at least have a way, for example, to control a couple of the settings. I don't even want or necessarily need live view, even though that would be a nice addition as well. But just being able to at least be able to make adjustments to the camera, start and stop recording, those kind of things, that would already be a great help. However, I don't have that module with the Wi-Fi and LAN module in the grip, so I cannot really talk about all of these other settings. You also have more settings here in terms of like what's going on there, but again, I don't really have the module, so that's why I can't really talk about this. Then we have the custom button layout. So you have a ton of buttons around the camera. You have here, you have the one up there, and you have all of these. And of course, you have one in the front of the camera, which is right down there. So there are a lot of options that you can choose from, and you can make your adjustments here in terms of like what you want to have on those buttons set up. There's really a long list of menu points that you might be able to or want to set there. To be honest, actually, I already came into the situation where I'm like, I would like to have like 3-4 more buttons on this camera, but we will have to work with what we got here. And what is really interesting is that you can actually have one button or your buttons set up to be something that you choose inside of the menu. So you can actually say this, for example, to be a user setting, and you can choose whatever menu point you want to be on that button. So that's really, really cool that they're giving us that kind of a flexibility. You can do this with 2 different pages. So again, there are even more buttons here, and you can see clearly outlined what button they're talking about based on the highlight that they're showing you on the screen. Lastly, you also have different buttons that you can adjust in the browser remote, which again is only available if you have the Wi-Fi battery grip down at the bottom of your camera. Going one over again, we have the other settings or system settings. Here you have the power source navigator. This is actually going to give you more information whether or not you can do something with your desired frame rate and recording resolution and format, and the lens that you're using, or what kind of a power source you might want to bring for your shooting. But I think that's really not that complicated. So just know that, for example, if you want to shoot 8K RAW with 60 frames per second and have autofocus in your lens, then you will need to bring, like, for example, a power source that you plug in via USB-C. Then you can reset the camera, transfer your menus to another camera via SD card. Now, I would actually love for profiles to be built into this so I can actually store multiple settings on the SD card and reload them with this menu. Right now, it is only possible to save the settings to the card, and it's always going to be saved into the same exact file. So there's no way, for example, to build any presets for multiple different use cases with this camera, except for using multiple SD cards. You have another set of settings in terms of language, date and time zone and those kind of things, but those are self-explanatory, I think. Here you have settings for the HDMI output. What kind of a resolution would you like to send out to the HDMI port? And you can actually link that to the monitor that is currently connected so that it's always going to choose the right one. Here we have timecode settings, and I will specifically talk about timecode settings in an upcoming video, and specifically talking about the system with Tentacle Sync that I'm using and their adapter cable that actually works with this camera. And now we are getting over to the different dials and how you can set those up. So in this case, for example, you have the grip control dial, and you can choose what kind of a setting this dial should actually control. And then we have the top control dial and the control ring. So you can make your own adjustments here and set your camera up however you want. And of course, you can also change the dial direction. So if you are used to it going this way or the other way, then you can make those adjustments here as well. Then we have the focus ring operation. You have the direction again, depending on how you're used to. And you can have the focus ring response either variable, so that it depends on the rotation speed, how far you're going to throw the focus, or if it's linked to the rotation degree, so that it's basically fixed, and no matter how fast you turn, it's always going to turn as fast as you turn it. And if you do variable, then it depends. If you're going really fast, it's going to go really far, and if you go really slow, then it's going to not so fastly focus or unfocus. Then we have another set of settings, in this case the locking mechanism. So you can either have the lock be persistent throughout a reboot or not, and you also can adjust whether it actually should lock the record button or not. Lastly, you can disable the record button at the front right here, so that you disable the red record button in the front of the camera. You can also assign different buttons the record functionality. So for example, you have the button at the left here, and you have the button at the top, and you have the button at the top right here. Those can also be assigned record buttons. And of course, you can also have a touch button on the screen and those kind of things. Then we have the tally lamp right here in the front, so that you can see whether or not you're recording from the front, and nobody is confused about that. But you can also, of course, disable that, so that either you don't want to have people know, or you want to have a very dark environment and you don't want to have a green light. And then the same thing goes for the card access. You can also make this little LED here either show up or not. And this may, again, be interesting or useful if you are, for example, in an environment that is extremely dark and you don't want to have a blinking red light when you're recording. Then we have the fan modes for this camera. Of course, it has a built-in fan, so it's not going to overheat on you. Here you can either say it should be always on, or it should be set to automatic. Then you can also define how you want the speed in standby as well as the speed while you're recording. Usually you probably are going to want to have this at low while you're recording, but you might actually want to adjust this to be a little higher when it's in standby, so that the camera cools down when you're not actively filming, so that the fan goes quieter for longer when you are back into the filming mode. Now, personally, I have it mostly set up to always on, but I will probably play around with this in the future. Then we also have the fan speed, and this is set to low in my case, so that it's basically just trying to stay as low as possible, and only if it's going to go too warm, then it's going to increase from there. And then we have the review recording. You can adjust, make this basically a button on your camera, and you can either choose it should be playing from the beginning or only just showing you the last 4 seconds to make sure that you got that ending. Then we have one last page, and that is actually about lens retracting, shutter at shutdown, and those kind of things. So you can choose what should happen when you are actually shutting down the camera. You should either make the lens retract if you have a lens that is doing that. You can choose whether you have the shutter down or open when you are shutting down the camera. And of course, you also can choose whether you want to have the sensor cleaning or not. Now you can do this at on and off, or just on power off. Now, something that's interesting here is when you're switching between photo and video mode, it might actually be interesting to have this set to off, because then you can actually switch faster between the different modes. However, I personally like it at the power off, and I do the same thing on the photo side, also on power off, so that basically whenever I switch the camera from video to photo mode, it's also going to go in and have one sensor cleaning, but not 2 of them. If you're setting it to auto power on and off, then you are going to have it either way twice right after another if you are, for example, switching between photo and video mode. Lastly, firmware stuff and those kind of things. I hope there's going to be more firmware updates for this camera in a very near future because I already have some things that I would like to be improved upon. Lastly, we have one last menu, but that's a menu that has no real menus in it because of course it is the My Camera setup or My menu so that you can set this up yourself and you can register which menu points you would like to have in your own menu setup so that you have a quick access for that. Now we are done with the main menu walkthrough, but I actually have one thing more to show you, and that is this little icon at the bottom left corner right there. And when you hit that, you can see there are actually a couple of things that are becoming touch enabled on this camera, like for example the white balance, the ISO, and of course the iris as well as the shutter angle. And the last one here at the bottom right is actually all of those other things like the focus guide, view assist, waveforms, and you can make those on. You can have peaking enabled as well as the zebras, for example, and you can see those going on and off on the screen. And this is actually really helpful and really nice. So that's another thing, but it also has another icon. So this is again activated when you are hitting this little icon in the bottom left corner, and that's the record settings. And with that, you can actually see all of your settings that you can do in terms of the format, and of course also the resolutions, frame rates, format, and your selected color profile and all of those kind of things. And here you have the recording settings for your second card, which again can be set up here on the first screen. So you can define what you want the second card to do. If it's a relay recording, proxy, sub-recording, all of those things can be made with these adjustments here as well. And it is relatively touch-friendly instead of going into this tiny little menu and the menus over here, like for example, going back into the menu and having to go over to this menu right here, where everything is really, really small. Now this concludes my walkthrough of the Canon EOS R5 C video menu. It is actually something that is really interesting to dig into and to get to know this new side of filmmaking, whereas I usually have been used to all of the menus of other cameras like the Canon EOS R, 5D Mark II, and so on. It's really interesting to get to know this different world and also learn how to use it effectively. Now, of course, there are things that I would like to be improved, like for example, being able to store multiple presets in terms of the setup that I can do for this camera without having to store it on an SD card and switching the SD card, because that would be so much nicer to be able to, for example, have a setting for interview recording and one setup for recording of, for example, slow motion and those kind of things. I hope this was an interesting and helpful video for you, and maybe it gave you a better understanding about the video side of things with the Canon EOS R5 C. Now with all that said, I hope to see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao!